Have you ever been in the middle of a project and you're on social media, YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok, and you see a new project that you just have to make? Yeah, we've all been there. For me, it's been a few garments. Most recently, it's been a bag, even though I'm in the middle of two other clothing projects. After about a week of making some actual progress, it's really easy to kind of lose some motivation when you don't see as much progress with your project and you inevitably chuck the project into your whip bin. I've definitely been there. It gathers so much dust that you can barely remember the project name, the pattern you're following, the hook size you're using. It's really easy to just forget all of that when you just cannot look at a project anymore. After a few years of dabbling with amigurumis, garments, blankets, and my most recent obsession, the tapestry bag, I want to share a few tips with you that help me not only reduce and limit my whip pile, but more importantly, tackle the boredom that often comes with projects so you're not looking at the new shiny project down the road. And jumping right into it is how I limit my whip pile, period. So first things first, of course, I'm not sure if anyone else relates to this, but even when I get excited to start new projects, I'm equally as anxious when I'm putting down my current project, because then I'm just like, oh no, I'm forgetting about it, and my anxiety goes through the roof because I have like 4, 5, 6 projects in my bin untouched for whatever reason. Either another project takes priority because of a timeline, or I ran out of the yarn, or I ran out of patience. Sometimes it also ends up in my whip bin for so long, I forget what the project was originally, and I don't even know what I was doing with it, especially if it comes in a lot of pieces. Other times, of course, it's easy to forget what hook size you're using, especially if you don't mark it down anywhere. And I personally haven't dealt with this, but I know others, sometimes their tension switches up. So when you work on a project now versus in a year later, your tension does change a little bit, or it can change anyway. So your project might end up with parts that are too tight or other parts that are too loose. So the way that I usually like to keep my whip bin reduced is to, one, just simply admire my project more. No matter how boring my project is, I kind of just remind myself that I'm a wizard and that I'm literally making clothes out of string. And that's just really cool to me, even if it's just really hard to see progress because maybe your hook and your thread is really small. But regardless of what the reason is, I kind of just sit there and admire my work sometimes. And sometimes I even go on the internet and I look at other people's projects and I'm just admiring what they've done, and it kind of gives me more motivation to finish my project. Sometimes if I really don't want to work on a project, I still try to trudge my way through because I don't like seeing my whip bin grow, and the way that I do that is by just setting a timer for myself. Whether it be 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, I try to spend a little bit of time with it each day just so I'm making a little bit of progress. And I could switch out with any other project as I'm doing that, but knowing that I'm making a little bit of progress each day is enough to kind of keep me going and making sure that it's not sitting in my bin, indefinitely. On the flip side, sometimes it's better to just frog the project that's either you're currently working on or that's the one that's been sitting in your whip bin. Maybe you don't love the project anymore, or your gift recipient for whatever reason is not taking your gift anymore. It's okay to frog your project, especially if it's been really hard to work on, or maybe you do have to set it aside, and that's okay. Just trying to keep your whip bin limited will help you not only save space, but also it'll help you save mental space in terms of tracking your project and knowing that there's an unfinished project out there somewhere. Also, I don't know about you, but just finishing a project does give me a lot of satisfaction because I'm just thinking, oh my god, I'm finally done. Even if I really did enjoy working on it most of the time, I'm also just as relieved sometimes to be finished with it because I know I spent 20, 30, 40 hours on a project, and I'm just like, oh thank god, I can move on to the other project that's been really catching my eye, because God knows we have too many projects on our to be crocheted list anyway. Sometimes I do have to chuck my project into a whip bin, usually when I don't have enough yarn and I'm just waiting for another order of yarn to come in. I usually stick a post-it, or I tack a post-it with a safety pin, or index card works too, just so I don't forget the hook size or the project that I'm working on. This helps me relieve a lot of mental anxiety about forgetting all of this, because I definitely have done that in the past. For some of you, an app might work better. I like to duplicate it both you know, handwriting it and putting it on the app just so I have multiple reminders of where it is if one or the other gets lost. I forgot to mention that although it's not conventional, because I'm a YouTuber, I do film a lot of what I'm making, and even when I chuck something into my bins, because you know I filmed it, I can see what hook size I use, and it's especially helpful with Clover or More hooks because they are actually color coded. Just an example, not all of these are from Clover or More, but based on the color of you know what I filmed, I can see what hook size I use, which has really come in handy. And if you know, if you're into that sort of thing, you can also just film, especially when you're starting your project, film what you're using and use that as a reminder for what you're using when you pick up your project, you know, 3 weeks later. This next tip pertains to when you're making clothes and you have a lot of color changes or a lot of balls of yarn that you're going through, and you just end up with a lot of ends to weave in at the end, and God knows it's a pain in the butt to weave in dozens, 50 something amount of ends at the end of your project. This is an issue because at the end, all you really want to do is wear your project. You don't want to look at it. You don't want to weave in those ends. It's a necessary evil because of whatever you're making. It just will look better with all those color changes. But the way that I like to deal with this is to just weave in my ends as I go. Whether it be every time I change colors or every couple of times I change colors and weaving in those ends before I start my new color. Or after a couple of rows, it's a really good visual motivation at the end of your project to see so few ends to go through. One way that I like to weave in my ends without, you know, a needle is that if the color changes at the end, I kind of just hide it behind my rows as I go through. The less I have to touch the needle, the better. Tapestries on the other end, I'm gonna be really lazy. So to be fair, I actually haven't finished my first full tapestry project, but this sneak peek into my next project is a bag that I'm going to make with a lot of ends to weave in. Actually quite few compared to what I've seen online, but this is what I'm dealing with for this one. For a bag specifically, I'm not going to sew in any of these ends. I'm just going to sew a lining and call it a day because no one really cares about the back anyway. Sewing a lining just adds structural integrity, whether it be a mosaic blanket or a dishcloth or, you know, whatever you're making. Most people just care about the front anyway, including yourself. When it comes to tapestry clothing, that's a little different. You're going to have to be a little neater, and you could sew a lining into the insides of your tapestry garments. I personally haven't seen it, but I'm sure it would look really good if you sewed like a silk lining in it. Maybe it would probably make your project really comfortable actually. But regardless, I think it's just worth it to sew in a lining. Saves you time, saves you energy, saves you a headache. At least it does for me. I know some people actually like sewing in their ends. Crazy people. The other thing about projects that usually makes me want to put them down because I'm so frustrated is sizing my garment. Of course, this wouldn't happen if I actually made a gauge swatch, but you know, who does that? More often than not, I do get frustrated with my projects because of sizing when I am not sure about how wide or how long or how, you know, whatever it may be. I don't know these things in my project because I don't make a gauge swatch, and I'm kind of just guessing along as I go through the cardigan, or mostly a cardigan, sometimes shirts, sweaters as well. But what I tend to struggle with is being worried about, you know, all that sizing as I'm going through. Usually the way that I combat against this is stretching whatever I'm making until it's taut or kind of at its limit, not, you know, pulling at it, but making sure that I'm kind of pretending or visualizing what it might look like after I wash it, because after you wash anything, your clothing usually gets a little bit looser just because your stitches are more relaxed. This is what blocking is, and it actually ends up a couple of inches wider or longer than you originally made it, and I kind of mimic that effect by stretching whatever I'm making. For example, this cardigan that I'm making right now is the Gemma cardigan. I already made one in the past for a friend, and let me tell you, it got big after it was washed. So that's something that I'm actually keeping in mind for this one. So this one is a panel that you can see like this, that when it's washed, this is what it looks like pre-washed. When it's washed, it really gets big. This is kind of like a preview of what it might look like when it's washed, and this is kind of like a small version before it goes anywhere. That's my way of getting around the gauge swatch. Of course, I could just make a gauge swatch and, you know, use that in my measurements, but we all have our things that we avoid. Generally, I also just like to compare my project against myself or my gift recipient's measurements after every couple of rows just to make sure I'm not, randomly increasing or decreasing, because I definitely have done that before. And just making sure that I am actually following the pattern correctly. And I've been able to make things smaller, or I was able to adjust my project based on my preferences because I was comparing it constantly. I've seen too many nightmare stories about people who, when they finish the project, it ends up way too wide or long, and I feel like it just makes it really easy to want to put down your project because you're just so disheartened at that point that you can't really fix it unless you add an elastic band perhaps, or you just have to frog it. On the note of making mistakes and frogging your project, it becomes really easy really quickly to become frustrated when you see a tiny mistake 10 rows back, maybe 20, maybe 30 rows back. Whether it be a missed stitch started increasing randomly, or you decreased randomly, you didn't make the color change where you were supposed to be, especially in the tapestry. These mistakes can become really easy to hone in on, especially, I like to call it like an artist problem, where you just stare at that one mistake and you feel like it defines the rest of your project. And you think that other people are going to notice the mistake. And I'm just going to be straight here. Most people do not notice that mistake. They're not looking that closely at the project. They kind of see the overall thing. They're like, wow, this looks amazing. Especially for small increases and decreases. I actually had that issue with one of my tapestries. I somehow ended up with 31 stitches, even though I'm supposed to be working with 30. And it might look slightly wonky, but my plan, I really didn't feel like going back and changing it. So my plan is to just stretch it a little bit. And in a bag where you are stitching 4, squares around this one tiny mistake, no one's gonna notice it. Of course, it depends on your situation. If you've been increasing your rows for 20 rows when you're supposed to stay a straight line, you can't really fix that. That is a case of where frogging might be necessary, but just keeping in mind that sometimes those small mistakes, if it's just a missed stitch, you can probably adjust. I definitely have made mistakes in many projects, and instead of going back hours to fix a tiny mistake that no one's going to notice and chucking it in my whip bin as a result, I just accept it and move along. I know there's a saying in the community that leaving a mistake gives room for your soul to escape. It's a little cheesy for me, but I like to think of leaving mistakes in your work as leaving a little piece of human in your project, knowing that it's not machine made, and although you think that you'll remember the mistake, you probably won't. Life's too busy to remember that tiny stitch that you didn't get correct. This is especially true with amigurumis. If you are working with plush yarn and you end up with too many stitches, just, decrease a row, put it somewhere, distribute it, you'll be fine. It'll look the same anyway at the end. And that's all the tips I have today for trying to stop your whip bin from growing, because it's really easy to become frustrated sometimes, but my favorite part really is just admiring my projects and remembering that I am making something out of basically nothing. If you want to check out my other video of more tips for just techniques that I use every day, check it out here. But other than that, I'll catch you next time. Bye! Happy crocheting!